the session. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce in alphabetical and presenting order, Stephen Augustine from the Cape Breton University, Matthew Dunn from the University of Saskatchewan, and Ruth Shead from the University of Manitoba. Stephen, you're up first. The floor is yours.
Okay, well, in terms of developing relations within the university, one of the prime motivators was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and its calls to action, specifically the calls to action on education. Call number 10, subsection number 3, develop culturally appropriate curricula for our students and peoples. Respect and honor treaty relationships, call to action number 10, subsection 7, and educate teachers at post-secondary institutions on how to integrate Indigenous knowledge and teaching methods in classrooms. So we at Cape Breton University had established I was trying to move my, can somebody move my
Yes, Stephen, we can have Penny do that for you. Penny, can you advance the slide?
Okay. So we were, the other motivating factor was Cape Breton University's strategic management plan. And the strategic management plan, there were 5 pillars, and the central pillar was indigenize the Ulnu way. And the strategies 21 to 23 focused on I can't even read my own my own slide here. I should have printed the larger components of it. I can't read it. I'm sorry. Oh yes, okay. Engaging elders and knowledge keepers and embedding the Ulnu perspectives in the curriculum and campus traditions. And Ulnu is a Mi'kmaq term that we apply to ourselves. Mi'kmaq was a term that was applied to us by the early French that arrived here. And so Ulnu, like Inu, is the term that we give ourselves. Strategy number 3.2 was creating spaces and opportunities for recognizing truth and seeking reconciliation. And strategy number 3 was enhancing efforts to preserve and promote the language that sustains our Ulnu culture. And strategy number 4 was making university education and resources increasingly accessible to Ulnu learners. And next slide. So learning about the Ulnu way was an experience that we developed collaboratively with all the staff that were involved, as well as some faculty and the Indigenous component of Unama'ki College. We had our communications people, we had our experts on providing this information online. So we had a starting point many years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. We had learning about the Mi'kmaq knowledge from the Mi'kmaq knowledge keepers. And we had a Mi'kmaq 2701 course. So on that note, we set up a course outline about 30 credits. So we kind of drew from that, but more for specific to individuals at the university level, because we were focusing this knowledge and learning process to staff and faculty at Cape Breton University. So learning about the Ulnu way kind of responds to the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, and it also focuses on indigenizing the Ulnu way as a strategic direction of Cape Breton University's strategic plan, which was approved by the Senate, by the Board of Governors. And so it was really an initiative that was brought together everybody's efforts on campus, and it was led by our president, David Dingwall. It is a self-directed video-based online learning experience, which is also a 30-hour proponent using the Moodle as a platform. And so the content was developed by Unama'ki College and the Center for Teaching and Learning at Cape Breton University. The contributors included Unama'ki College chiefs, elders in our communities, and other community members, along with Cape Breton University faculty and staff. Next slide, please. And learning about the Onu way was set up in a self-directed learning process where people could hear the creation story, see the video of me telling the creation story, as well as doing the smudging ceremony and the pipe ceremony that is instructed, directed, informed by the Mi'kmaq creation story. And so these ceremonies were attached to the learning process, and students or proponents who are taking this learning process learned about the meaning of Mi'kmaq, like the pipe ceremony, the sweat lodge ceremony, the smudging ceremony, tobacco offering ceremony, the fire keeper ceremony, and everything that is related to our negotiating for our survival. And by giving thanks through our ceremonies, this is how we were engaging in negotiating for our survival going forward. And then we looked at harvesting those negotiating processes, like one of the ones were moose hunt by our local Indigenous experts, taking young people out on the land and shooting the moose, and then showing them how to clean a moose and the ceremonies that are attached before hunting the moose and after killing the moose, and then dividing it up, and then having a community meal with the students and elders from our communities and chiefs, and going actually right on the land in Hunter's Mountain in Cape Breton, where they set the tables and had fires and teepees and a camp set up, and for the day people went there. So they learn about how we survived on the land, and then our harvesting processes, fishing, hunting, gathering medicines and food, and so on and so forth. And then we talked about contact and settlement, how the early peoples arrived here, and the conflicts that the French and English had here out in the Maritimes, and then the treaties that we entered into with the British, and then the American Revolution happened in 1780, in the 80s. I mean, it was settled and then United Empire Loyalists invade the Maritime provinces and Quebec and Ontario. And then Indian Act happens after Confederation. And then we talk about the Indian Act, what it is, the reserve systems, who is an Indian. And then we talked about Indian residential schools, the Mi'kmaq Grand Council, which is a traditional governance structure that we have in the Maritimes. I am a member of the Mi'kmaq Grand Council. I'm a hereditary chief. And then we also talk about the First Nations governance structure of the Indian Act elected chiefs. We had Donald Marshall Jr., who was accused of killing a friend of his here in Cape Breton. And so he was imprisoned for 11 years, but wrongfully accused, and he spent 11 years in prison for that murder until he was released and absolved of his crime through another inquiry. And then we also talked about treaty education in Nova Scotia, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, our Mi'kmaq language, taxation, the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, healthcare barriers, barriers to health services, Indigenous research and programming at Cape Breton University. So the whole kind of the program itself educated staff and faculty about the reality of Indigenous people around them, and to know the names of the reserves and communities and chiefs and organizations. Next slide, please. So learning about the Ulnu Way was, like I said earlier, it was a Moodle platform, and it was set up in such a way that you could teach classes in a Moodle context. So the topics were set out as I had indicated earlier. I listed all those topics, and then the lessons were, were written out in a kind of a general context. And then the question was posed to the person that's taking the course, and they would successfully reply to a good answer. They would get a badge and move on to the next until they finished the whole 30 units, I think, and they were 1 hour, 30 minutes each. So part 2 was a community cultural experience or workshop. So people had to say that they attended a powwow, or they attended a sweat lodge ceremony, or pipe ceremony, or sweetgrass picking, or beading, or dream catcher workshops, either here on campus or in the community. And they would just have show a letter that they participated in this process. And then a reflection. The third part was a poem, a video, an essay, an art form. And that was the whole structure of the experience. Next slide. So in terms of lessons learned and moving forward, we were thinking that the potential next steps could involve converting the learning experience and offer it as a 30-credit Cape Breton University course, focusing on Indigenous First Nations, as well as the outcomes of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and all the calls to action, and as they pertain to education. Create a cultural education offering to be available externally for professional development, like cross-cultural education or education integrity. Challenges would be develop a marketing plan for both. Transfer the learning experience to a new technological platform. We did it on an old Moodle platform, and we have to redevelop this if we want to move it to a new platform. Maintain the status quo by continuing learning about the Ulnu Way as part of Cape Breton University's orientation process. That's when the university, when new employees arrive at Cape Breton University, this is one of the initiatives that they have to take, is this cross-cultural learning about the Ulnu Way. So that's pretty well covers the, so that pretty well covers the context of that, and I think I just took up the 15 minutes I was allocated, and I would say, well, Alio, thank you very much for listening to me, and I thank the Canadian Council for the Advancement of Education for awarding us this gold award to Cape Breton University. Thank you, Walalio.
Well, thank you, Stephen, for that excellent presentation. So my presentation will highlight the objectives of the 3rd annual māmowi āsohtētān, or Let's Cross This Together, internal Truth and Reconciliation Forum, and will provide details on the planning, implementation, and outcomes of that forum. I'll share some lessons learned, as well as how feedback was incorporated into the 4th annual forum. So my name is Matt Dunn. I'm the Senior Strategic Officer in the Office of the Vice-Provost Indigenous Engagement at the University of Saskatchewan. I am a member of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, which is in Treaty 8 territory and the homeland of the Métis up in northern Alberta. I currently live and work in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, which is Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. Saskatoon is a wonderful place to live and work and raise a family, so I pay my respect to the First Nation and Métis ancestors of this place. So the objectives for the forum were to work together across Indigenous and non-Indigenous cultures to inspire deeper relationships and mutual understanding, to increase awareness and knowledge of First Nation and Métis protocols for community engagement, to create opportunities to share experiences, both positive and negative, that would help contribute to individual and collective healing and learning, to identify university policies, procedures, and practices that present as barriers to reconciliation and decolonization, and to empower participants with resources and tools, and enabling them to take action on reconciliation and indigenization in their own lives. So beginning in 2017, the university started an annual reconciliation-themed internal forum. And this came out of the National Building Reconciliation Forum that happens in 2015 that the University of Saskatchewan hosted. And this internal forum aimed at bringing together faculty, staff, and students to listen, learn, and engage with local and national initiatives to help inform indigenization and reconciliation among our campus community. The third annual forum, third annual internal Truth and Reconciliation Forum took place on Friday, February 28th, 2020, from 8:30 to 4:30 p.m. with over 250 participants in attendance at Marcos Hall. So this is about 2 weeks before COVID-19 shut everything down. So we're really fortunate to be able to have this event in person. The day started and ended with prayers by Elder Louise Half, and Elder Norman Fleury provided prayers and remarks during lunch. Indigenous students Andre Bear and Autumn Lero Smith were the MCs, and they gracefully facilitated the day's flow of events and commented thoughtfully on the learnings through their own stories, teachings, and humor. And they just did a really excellent job. There were 4 keynote speakers: the Lieutenant Governor Russell Morasti, former National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations Phil Fontaine, human rights lawyer Kathleen Mahoney, and Cree professor Willie Ermine. Each keynote introduced and spoke to one of the 4 themes of the forum. So that was educational policy and racism, Indigenous wellness, reconciliation, and ethical space. After each keynote speech, dedicated time was given for roundtable conversations to unpack the theme. The conversations were guided by the following 3 questions. What do you know about this theme? What policies and programs could be created or built upon at the University of Saskatchewan to help the theme? And how did the keynote speakers address the theme? So we printed off pages at each table with those questions, and we asked people sitting at the table, someone to take notes. We also had dedicated note takers, so there were 4 graduate students that we hired to kind of roam around the room and take notes throughout the day. Witnesses were a pivotal part of the day. The planning committee invited 4 forum witnesses and also asked colleges and schools to designate an attending witness from their college that moved throughout the conversation circles, listening and noting important and insightful points and reflections. And then the forum concluded with a closing ceremony that had the forum witnesses, Eugene Arcand, Regan Rat-Mispinis, Marilyn Poitras, and Brian Couture reflect on the themes of the day. Then there was a prayer and a round dance song to conclude the event. So in terms of planning and implementation, the leadership and the direction for the forum came from the Vice-Provost Indigenous Engagements, Dr. Jackie Ottman, who's now the president of the First Nations University of Canada. There was a planning committee as well, who met regularly, so bi-weekly in November and December, and then weekly in January and February leading up to the event. And the planning committee would discuss suggestions and make decisions on things such as the keynote speakers, the performers throughout the day, and they were responsible for the logistical work in between the meetings as well. So there was homework for the committee. It was a diverse group with people from across campus with very strong opinions because they cared a lot about the forum. So I bring that up because as the chair of the planning committee, my goal at the meetings was to facilitate the conversation so that everyone felt like they had their voice heard because they all had really excellent ideas that they brought to these meetings. There was an event planner who was instrumental to the success of the event. Marcy Hildebrand provided direction on the logistical work. She completed a lot of the work itself as well. There were volunteers who provided support during the forum as well. So it really was a huge team effort. There were Indigenous practices and protocols that were woven throughout the forum. So we had invited elders to start and end the forum in a good way, followed proper protocol in terms of engaging and inviting those elders to be a part of the day. There was a Treaty 6 honor song and a Métis, the Métis national anthem. Those are both performed by Indigenous students. There were also Métis and First Nations performers during lunch. And then at the end of the day, those were also students, ITEP students and SUNTEP students. We had talking circles. The conversation circles were in the form of talking circles. We were very intentional about having diverse groupings within those conversation circles to help facilitate ethical space. We had the forum witnesses and the college witnesses. The physical space, the room itself, with the tables, instead of just lining them up in rows or lines, we set them up in 2 concentric circles or rings. And then as the note takers and as the witnesses went around the room, they went in that clockwise direction around the circle. And then gifting was present throughout the forum as well. So in terms of outcomes and lessons learned, we did a pre and a post survey to measure achievement of those 5 forum objectives, as well as overall satisfaction with the event. So 169 participants answered the pre-survey. From those, there were 43 that also answered the post survey. The majority of respondents identified as non-Indigenous at 64%, with 17% identifying as First Nations and 8% identifying as Métis. 86% of the survey respondents were satisfied or very satisfied with the communication before the event. 90% were satisfied or very satisfied with the organization of the event, and 86% were satisfied or very satisfied with the hospitality of the event. We had really good food that day, free food, free lunch, coffee and tea throughout the event. So I think that was an important component of the hospitality satisfaction. In terms of those 5 objectives, the pre-survey had a very high rate of agreement with this outcome, with no large change in the pre-survey to the post-survey data. So from this data, the event itself did not meet or change this intended outcome. However, qualitatively from the conversation circle data and the witnesses, it was a rationale offered as to why participants attended this event. For the second objective, the data did illustrate a high rate of agreements in the pre-survey, but no noteworthy change in the post-survey data. So the social and cultural use of protocols in the event may not have been significantly noticed and thus not reflected in the survey outcome. The conversation data did speak extensively about community, and the brochure did address protocols. So the question may have been too broad to receive the answers it was intended. For the third objective, this outcome demonstrated some positive change in the data, with participants noting more agreement and less neutrality after the event. So this was one of the objectives that was met according to the pre and post survey data. The conversation data also reaffirmed this outcome with a strong level of sharing of personal stories and experiences. For the fourth objective, this was seen as a significant theme within the conversation circle data and was present in all 4 themes of the day. There were more participants that strongly agreed and less that were neutral after the event. So this was another objective that was met based on the pre and post survey data. And finally, the 5th objective, the pre-survey had a very high rate of agreements within this outcome and no noteworthy change in the pre-survey to the post-survey data. So from this, the event itself did not effectively meet this intended outcome. The knowledge of existing resources may have been present before the event, and it is unknown if attending the event raised awareness of additional resources and tools. So in terms of recommendations, the feedback we received in terms of recommendations, one was to leave more time in the agenda for engagement through the conversation circles, as well as more time for breaks and networking. It was a very full agenda. We were really ambitious with the number of themes, with the number of keynotes. And so some of the sessions went long, that ate into the break time. And that's where a lot of the networking or visiting would occur. So that was one recommendation, to just leave more time in the agenda. Another one was another one related to that was to have 2 themes instead of 4, and select keynotes that can speak specifically to the theme. The 4 keynotes we had were excellent. And the stories they shared were really powerful and moving. They didn't necessarily, because their experience was so broad, it didn't necessarily have a direct connection to the theme they were assigned to. So that was one recommendation, was to have a keynote that can have that direct connection. There were recommendations about the conversation circles. So there was a suggestion to switch up the groupings by changing who was at the table. Throughout the day, we had the people assigned to tables, and they would stay at those tables throughout the day. There was this recommendation to have tables designated to specific colleges or college-specific concerns, and then as well to seat people together who have the same level of knowledge about the theme. So that was an intentional choice on our part to have those diverse groupings within the table to help facilitate ethical space. One outcome of that is if you have people at the table with a lower level of knowledge sitting with people with a higher level of knowledge, those people with more experience will then spend time educating those and may not have as fruitful of conversations. And the final recommendation was to connect the outcomes or the objectives more directly to the themes and the keynotes. We had the 5 objectives, the 4 themes, and we could have had those more directly connected. So we did listen to the recommendations for the 4th annual forum. So that was the one from this year. So for the 4th annual forum, we had 1 theme that was theories, principles, and practices of anti-racism and anti-oppression. There was 1 keynote speaker in the morning, Dr. Verna St. Dennis, who is an expert in this field. The morning conversation circle was a full hour and was organized into breakout rooms with people at that same level of knowledge and experience, so they could have those more in-depth conversations. And then in the afternoon, we had 1 panel about anti-racist education. The afternoon conversation circle was a full hour. That one was organized into diverse groupings again. So we had that balance between people in the morning with the same level of knowledge, and then in the afternoon with diverse groupings to facilitate ethical space. And I just want to end the presentation with the picture shown here by one of the witnesses, Brian Couture. So he's a very talented artist and graphic designer, and he created this during the forum and shared it along with some remarks at the end of the day. So it's a very beautiful piece of artwork, and thanks for the time to present today.
Perfect. We're just getting Ruth.
Thank you.
Mic on.
Thank you so much. Yeah, for some
There
reason
she is.
the icon disappeared to take me out, or to let myself take myself off mute. Anyways, thank you so much, Matt and Stephen. Those are so good to learn about what you've been doing. And yeah, I'm gonna probably call you up after this is over. So I just want to introduce myself first before I get started. My name is Ruth Shead. My pronouns are she, her. I am an auntie, a sister, a daughter, a friend, a storyteller. I'm a Cree citizen of Peguis First Nation, and I'm also of mixed settler ancestry, primarily Irish and a little bit of English. And my role at the University of Manitoba is I am the Director of Indigenous Engagement and Communications, and I have my email address there for anyone who might want to get in touch. And this is a picture of my heart, who's my little niece. She's now 10, so that was taken a while ago, but yeah, I feel like being an auntie is one of my most important roles in this world. I am also the daughter or granddaughter of a residential school survivor. My grandma Ruth was sent to Elkhorn Residential School in the 1920s. This is on the far left, a picture of her. This is a picture of the survivors of the time when she attended Elkhorn Residential School. It's a picture from the NCTR archives. And then there's a couple of other pictures. There's me with my grandma. So I call her the original Ruth Shead, and a picture of her with my grandpa, who was a member of Fisher River Cree Nation. He did not go to residential school. He was what Canada calls enfranchised at the time, so he did not attend. Today I'm here to talk to you about our Indigenous Scholars speaker series, as well as our Indigenous Scholar Profile series, which is an initiative that we started, and I'll give a little bit of background of where it came from. So I joined the University of Manitoba in 2014, late 2014, and one of the reasons I joined the university was because I was aware of their strategic plan. And the strategic plan had 5 main priorities, and one of those priorities was to create pathways to Indigenous achievement. We've changed the language since, but Indigenous achievement was what the goal was at the time. And not only was it one of 5 priorities, but to create these pathways to Indigenous achievement was woven throughout all of the priorities. And in order to create an academic space that, you know, is moving towards more Indigenous engagement and supporting Indigenous students, one thing that's recognized is we need Indigenous faculty members. And so in 2016, the University of Manitoba introduced what it calls the Indigenous Scholars Fund. And so the fund was made available for faculties to apply for to recruit Indigenous scholars, and funds were available for 6 positions. So faculties applied to central administration. They said, you know, here's why we feel like we would like an Indigenous scholar. And through that process, 6 Indigenous scholars were hired. The executive lead of Indigenous achievement at the time was Dr. Frank Deere, who's a faculty member in education. And he said, you know, for himself, when he began studying at the University of Manitoba, there were very few Indigenous scholars. So having a fund that would support the recruitment of more Indigenous scholars would bring more ways of knowing into curriculum. It would introduce future students to more knowledge that they could graduate with, including Indigenous ideologies, practices, and wisdom. And more Indigenous students would see themselves in learning spaces. So the fund was successful. 6 were hired in the first round, and then it was made available another time. And so 12 scholars were recruited over a short period of time. The picture on the right is Dr. Lynn LaValle. She was hired as the University of Manitoba's first Vice-Provost of Indigenous Engagement. And in 2018, it was her idea to actually have an Indigenous Scholars speaker series. And so that's when we started to host this series. So the purpose of the series is to highlight the academic journeys, expertise, and research of Indigenous scholars at the University of Manitoba, to demonstrate the ways Indigenous scholars are producing and sharing knowledges, and to show how their work is changing the landscape of learning at the University of Manitoba and transforming communities. Oh, and I'll just back up. So this is Dr. Lara Fitzner, who is now retired, but she was a long-serving faculty member in the Faculty of Education as well, and an incredible leader who has certainly mentored many Indigenous and all other students through their degrees in education and graduate studies. So I was asked to speak specifically how the COVID-19 pandemic changed things for this initiative. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we began delivering the speaker series virtually. That allowed us to expand our circle. So we had a much larger audience since I guess March 2020. It also was an opportunity for us through the profile series to highlight Indigenous leadership throughout the pandemic. We have several scholars working at the University of Manitoba whose work has really made sure that First Nations communities are kept safe during the pandemic, and as well as working to advocate for similarly for Métis people in the province as well as significant research. Dr. Merle Ballard is someone who's doing some very interesting research and around even communications to First Nations communities about the pandemic. It also reinforced for us the importance of Indigenous-led storytelling. So I'll go through all three of these points a little bit more thoroughly. So space for a larger audience. So when we began the series in person back in 2018, we booked a room, and it comfortably seats probably 50 people. And at the first talk, it was standing room only. We brought out some more chairs, and we realized not everyone could come to the space during a 1-hour lunch break. And so we would take our iPhones and we'd record the talk. Dr. Barry LaValle was the inaugural Indigenous scholar speaker, and he, the talk, even though it was recorded on an iPhone, had almost 2,000 views on Facebook. So just goes to show how interested people are in learning what the Indigenous scholars at the university are doing, and to engage in some really important conversations. That first scholar speakers talk, Dr. LaValle really spoke to some incidences, not even incidences, just like systemic anti-Indigenous racism that happens on campus. And it really ignited some conversations that have resulted in significant change at the university. It empowered students to speak up about their own personal experiences. It led to the creation of a series of consultations that have resulted in us now having the development of an anti-Indigenous racism strategy. And so these talks are really important, and they are really vital conversations for institutions that might not have been used to having conversations like this. So again, through COVID, we continue to stream the talks to Facebook, but it's much higher quality, and it allows us also to allow those videos to stay online. And that, as long as the scholars give permission, because of course the content is the scholars' content. The picture here is just from our events calendar listing. It's a screen grab. That's Kayla Johnston. She's the Director of Education for the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. And so of course in September, we had her as our inaugural speaker for this year's series, and the audience allowed, even classrooms to tune in, where, that's just something we wouldn't be able to do if we were in person, right? We wouldn't have teachers bringing their classrooms of students to campus for a 1-hour break, but they're able to, just play it in the class, and students can be eating their lunch at their desks. Okay, so like I had mentioned earlier, we were able to highlight Indigenous leadership throughout the pandemic through the profile series. So that's the series of articles that come out on our, what's called Today. It's our news site. And so on the left is Dr. Marcia Anderson. She has been instrumental throughout the pandemic. And I'm just going to grab a note here that I wrote about her. So she led the provincial equity table discussions that examined the disproportionate impacts of COVID-19 on structurally disadvantaged populations, and determined how those might be mitigated. She also participates in the Manitoba First Nations COVID-19 Pandemic Response Coordination Team. On the right is Melanie McKinnon, and Melanie actually is the lead for clinical operations with the Manitoba First Nations COVID-19 pandemic response team. And she describes that team as one that blurs organizational lines and includes professional leads for social supports, economic supports, public safety, child and family services support, and mental health and addiction. So I just pulled a couple of quotes from the profiles that we had written about them. So Marcia says, I breathe, eat, and sleep all things COVID-19 right now, and a lot of other work has been put on hold so I can focus on my role as a public health physician. Marcia, she has been, you know, you wouldn't know that she's put things on hold, because if you follow her online at all, she's always teaching something about keeping our family safe throughout the pandemic, and you know, making sure people understand how vaccines work, and making sure that people understand what, you know, those wraparound supports are available for them. Melanie, the quote I pulled from her, it became very clear to First Nation healthcare leaders that we needed to make sure our communities did not fall through the cracks between the provincial and federal healthcare systems. Again, Melanie is the lead, the clinical lead for the Manitoba First Nations COVID-19 pandemic response team, and she's been recognized for her leadership and making sure that all of the details are taken care of as we continue to manage through this pandemic. And the final point I wanted to make is the importance of Indigenous-led storytelling. And on the left-hand side here, there's a picture of a project called Perception. And it was actually done by my cousin, Casey Adams, who is a well-known artist in our communities. And on the left-hand side, so she did this project quite a few years ago, and she had a series of photos that she put together. And there would be one on the left that was basically showing somebody, and then they described the stereotypes and racism that they face as an Indigenous person. And then she would take a second picture after asking the person who was being photographed, you know, who are you really, and what makes you happy? And so the reason why we need Indigenous-led storytelling is that often people don't know their unconscious biases, or they do know them and it doesn't matter to them. And so I think the more we can get Indigenous people telling stories, the less paternalistic stories seem to sound, because I know when the series started, there was a few articles that were written by people who don't identify as Indigenous, and there's often like this tone, it's like, well, Indigenous people can be scholars too. Well, of course, yes, we've always known this, but you know what? If we have an Indigenous writer writing the story, it just has a different tone that just is more nuanced and understanding of the issues. It takes it a step further than kind of a surface level, you know, description of the research. The middle picture here is actually, I used to work in media. So this is the team that we had when we produced a show at CBC called Revision Quest. And that show ran for five summers. And it was a show where we used humor, fact, and journalism to bust up myths and stereotypes about Indigenous people and communities. And we had a great time making it, but again, it was something that couldn't be produced by anyone who wasn't Indigenous, because there would be like a lack of understanding about the sense of humor that needed to be there for the humor piece. And there would be a lack of understanding of why something might be hurtful. The first episode, the host, Daryl Dennis, who's in the middle there in the red shirt, he went down to a car dealership with his microphone and recorder, and he said, "I'm here for my free truck." And I don't know, well, no one else could do that, right? Like, you need to have somebody who has had the experience of being asked by, non-Indigenous people, oh, I hear you get everything for free. To be able to do that and to go down and say, like, see how ridiculous this is if you actually like to do it in person. So it was again important for Indigenous people to be telling Indigenous stories. And then finally, the photo on the right there is a photo of Sonia Ballantyne. And Sonia is an alumna of the University of Manitoba. She's Cree. She is a storyteller. She is a filmmaker. She was the first Cree person to ever present on a panel at the San Diego Comic-Con. She's super cool. And when we were figuring out what we should be doing to welcome students to virtual campus this year, we asked her to write a piece for our Today site. And she said notes from an alumna auntie, and she is able to speak to students who are coming from northern communities, whereas I couldn't do that. I've always lived in the South. I've mostly lived in cities my whole life. I do not have that experience. And so we need people who have shared experiences to be speaking using the familiar references and that students can connect with in order to make students feel like they belong, not to make them feel like they have to fit in to our spaces. So again, I just want to stress that having Indigenous-led storytellers kind of can get us away from those paternalistic stories. It will, hopefully prevent the non-Indigenous storytellers from, revealing their unconscious biases or maybe their straight up biases. Indigenous storytellers have a more familiar way of explaining stories and nuanced, and some of the rules of writing just aren't the same. I even remember when somebody was, well, first of all, so this first picture of Laura, I'm just going to scroll back to it. So she's holding a feather in her picture, and the photographer, who was a non-Indigenous person, said, oh, well, we should do some without. And she's like, absolutely not, because I know you'll pick the one without the feather to make my photo. So just she's experienced, she knows, Laura knows, like you can't to keep control of our own stories, right? And then even Sonia, there was the editor who was editing her piece, sent it to me, and I was like, well, you've changed a bunch of words here, and so now you've lost a lot of meanings. So I changed them all back to what Sonia had originally written. So what's next with the Indigenous Scholars series? So on the left here, we have a grad student who was just in the news. She is from Seguin, and she has she's been working on technology for early detection of breast cancer. So of course we want to expand our profile series to include graduate students who are doing important work. In the middle, it's kind of hard to see because it's so tiny, but Dr. Kyle Bobbywash, who is a young Indigenous scholar in the Faculty of Agricultural and Food Sciences, recently gave a talk, and he really stressed the need to, again, make sure that when we are talking about Indigenous students, or talking about recruiting Indigenous students, that they know there's young Indigenous scholars like himself who are trying to create different learning opportunities. He does a lot of land-based learning. He has established a few partnerships with First Nations in Manitoba, and really different than what I think, back when I went to school, there weren't these opportunities to work more directly with Indigenous scholars and communities. And then on the right there is just another example of how we are ensuring we're telling the entire story of the Indigenous community at U of M. So we have this thing called Indigenous Colleague Connection, which we include in a monthly newsletter where we introduce an Indigenous staff member on campus to talk a little bit about who they are, what they've been doing, why they do what they do. And I think it's important for us. It builds community, and it's really exciting. So I think that's all I have. I want to say ekasane and thank you. Of course, I'm here speaking to you today, but the whole series is not possible with a whole team of people. I think of it similar to putting up a teepee, takes many people. So Nikita Longman, who recently left the U of M for a different job, was one of our main, or was our main writer for the profile series. Sarah Olson is somebody who coordinates the scholars to come and give talks. Andrea Danilik is somebody we work closely in our marketing office, who is an all-star editor and makes sure all of our stories get distributed out through many channels. Jenny Trenchard, who works in our office, makes sure all of our calendars up to date and making sure we can meet properly at the same times, and booking rooms and Zooms. And Brittany and Cindy are our work study students who, again, are helping us get the word out about these events. And Grace Redhead is our events manager. She's new to our team, and she has started to, again, facilitate some of the times for these. Dr. Lynn LaValle, whose idea it was for the series, of course, all of the scholars and the photographers who took all the beautiful photos, and our external relations team, who actually were the folks who submitted us for this award. So thanks to everyone, and thank you all for listening today.
There we go. Hi, everyone. Thank you to our three presenters. That was exceptional and a real demonstration of the great work that's going on across the country. It's clear why you are the three winners sitting here with us, and we are down to the wire. So I don't think we're going to have time for a ton of questions, but just drawing comparisons and listening to your stories. There's a lot of notes about authenticity and storytelling and making sure that people are spotlighted and their voices are heard, and it's from the people telling the stories. Any closing thoughts, last minute pieces? Stephen, you went first. Matt, you went in the middle. Any observations or quick notes to share before we close for the day? And you're all still muted, so I can help you unmute so we can get some of your closing thoughts. Go ahead.
Okay, I learned a lot from the other presenters, a lot of the initiatives that were instrumental in the universities they are working at, and especially collaborating with the rest of the university as non-Indigenous peoples to raise awareness of our existence and our realities. And so I think they raised a lot of good points that we can probably exchange ideas with some of the participants there. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I have to say, I spent time with the three presenters, and part of me wanted to just let them talk amongst themselves for 60 minutes and have everyone listen, because just their exchanges amongst themselves as experts in these areas is extremely appreciated. Matt, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just echo Stephen's comment. Just great to learn about some of the other great work that's happening at other institutions, and just to reiterate again how much of a team effort it was to plan and have the forum, and just a lot of people put in a lot of time and effort into making that happen. So thankful for everyone that was involved.
Perfect. Thanks, Matt. And Ruth, you went through it. I know any closing, I know you guys tried to stick as much information as possible. Ruth, anything that you want to add?
Just again, thank you for having us today. And yeah, really thanks, Matt and Stephen. I was taking screenshots because I was like, oh, this is so good. And then I was like, I have a copy of this, so I can stop taking screenshots. But I did learn so much from both of you, and yeah, excited to continue to connect. Thanks.
Perfect. Some notes in the chat saying, great presentation. Thank you for your time. Yes, this presentation will end up in CCA's archives as well as our resource page. The presentation, if you'd like a copy of the PDF, is available. We can send that to you as well. You just don't have the charisma of our speakers reading to you what's going on. You have their slides. Folks, thank you, the three of you, for being here and for sharing your expertise and for very well representing your teams. Ruth went through the whole list. I know some of those people, and it's mentioned, and you see, and I know Brian and the great team at CBU, and it really does. There's a lot of hands involved in all of these projects. It's a ton of collaboration because the whole village has to be connected, and they have to look forward and aligned on mission and vision. And that's what we have to do across campuses, across the country, in order to move not just these projects forward, but community, volunteer, student-facing projects in any direction. So on that note, we're coming to the end of the hour. Thank you to all of you who are in attendance with us today, to our presenters and the institutions and the communities that you represent. Thank you very much. And for our next e-learning session, we will be here in December. I look forward to seeing you there, and I wish you all a very wonderful afternoon. Thanks, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, Tara.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Stephen.